Something is blocking the light inside 3i Atlas, and nothing should be there. The leaked image looks wrong from the first second. Geometry where nature makes chaos. A stable void where dust should swirl. A silhouette too precise to be accidental. And when Avi Loeb ran the orbital statistics again, the probability that Atlas's encounter with Jupiter happened naturally collapsed to 0.00005%. If you think that sounds engineered, you're not alone. Don't go anywhere, because what we found next forces some researchers to quietly use the word parking, and by the end of this you'll understand why no one in the institutions will comment on the record. I'm sitting here at 3:11 a.m., wide awake, skin buzzing, replaying the last 12 hours in loops because my brain refuses to file this under anything normal. The hum of the refrigerator behind me feels louder than it should, like the whole house is holding its breath. I'm staring at the calibrated photometry charts, the corrected spectral frames, the infrared overlays that shouldn't show what they show. And for the first time since I started working in astrophysics, I feel like the universe has turned around and looked back at us. Atlas, 3i ATLS, is evolving. Fast. Faster than thermodynamics, chemistry, or common sense allow. I don't even know how to say this without sounding unhinged, but the object doesn't look like a comet anymore. It's bigger, significantly bigger. And the color. God, the color is the part that won't leave my mind. Red-violet halos blooming across its terminator line, pulsing like slow arterial beats. Red beams, thin, structured, coherent, lancing outward at intervals too regular to dismiss as jets or fragmentation outbursts. And every time a beam flashes, our magnetometer arrays here on Earth twitch like someone plucking an invisible string between us. I'm jumping ahead. Let me try to rewind, though everything in me wants to sprint straight to the ending of this day. It started quietly. My shift began at 6 p.m. at the West Ridge Observatory in northern Arizona. Tucked into a desert so wide and empty, the silence feels like vacuum. I was processing archived frames from last week, cross-checking rotation estimates. Routine, boring, peaceful. Atlas had been fading as expected, slipping outbound after perihelion. We thought we'd gotten our data window and missed the rest. Then at 7:43 p.m., the outbound telemetry from our automated sweep flagged something unusual. Atlas's albedo curve had spiked. Not slightly, violently. The kind of jump that normally means fragmentation, but the spectral temperature didn't match exposed ice or dust plumes. It was hotter, much hotter. I remember leaning closer to the screen, my breath fogging faintly on the glass. My first thought was that the data was corrupted, cosmic ray noise maybe, or a calibration drift. But then the second observatory chimed in with the same anomaly, then a third. When you're in this field long enough, you learn to trust triangulation more than your own instincts. 3 independent systems don't hallucinate in sync. I called Hunter, a colleague at Caltech, while pulling the real-time feed. He picked up instantly, breathless, like he'd been waiting for someone else to see what he was seeing. He said, "It's red. Just that. It's turning red." I opened the feed, expecting dust heating, maybe sodium emission, something cometary. What came through didn't fit any category. Atlas had inflated, its coma stretching into a massive, irregular, almost wing-shaped silhouette, too sharply defined along the edges. And the red wasn't diffuse, it was directional. Vectors of crimson sweeping outward in rigid lines, like light refracted through machinery rather than outgassing. My stomach tightened, a cold, weightless feeling that made me grip the edge of the desk. I asked Hunter what the vectors were aligned to. His silence stretched for a beat too long. He finally said, "Earth. They're pointing toward Earth. Let me be clear here. Jets don't align. Outgassing doesn't target. Cometary emissions look like anyone would expect. chaotic, violent, random, but these were converging on a bearing, a fixed one. By 9 p.m., the Emergency Coordination Network was awake. Screens lit up with familiar names: Glenn from NASA Goddard, Marisa from MIT, Ross from JPL, all of them talking at once, their faces illuminated by the same impossible red halos morphing across their feeds. Atlas wasn't fragmenting. It was transforming, growing. Every hour its apparent diameter increased, not by much, but enough that by 10:30 the size discrepancy became undeniable, as if something beneath the surface was pushing outward from the inside, like it was shedding an old form. Or hatching. That thought came uninvited, and I immediately tried to bury it. But fear has a way of echoing inside the skull even when you try to drown it with math. At 11:14 p.m., the first image leak hit our private channel. Someone in the Chilean remote array uploaded a raw, enhanced frame before protocol told them not to. I don't blame them. The frame showed it clearly. The core wasn't spherical anymore. It had angles. Dark, repeating angles forming a hexagonal shadow in the center of the brightening red glow. A geometric cavity. Not just unexpected, impossible. I froze. My pulse felt loud in my ears. Geometry is manufactured. Nature curves. Machinery cuts. It's an artifact, Glenn said over the call, but his voice had lost its usual hard certainty. Someone else added weakly, ice fracture pattern. Multiple overlapping jets, said another voice. No one believed their own explanations. The silence after the next frame dropped told the truth. The hexagon deepened, sharpened, stabilized across wavelengths. The last fragments of natural explanation died right there. Around midnight, I noticed something in the motion metrics. Atlas had changed course. Not by much. Not enough for the public-facing orbital trackers to catch, but enough that any dynamicist would feel their throat close. Atlas was no longer following a purely hyperbolic exit trajectory. It was bending, correcting, redirecting ever so slightly toward Earth. I sat back in my chair, palms sweating despite the desert cold sneaking through the observatory walls. I said aloud to myself, someone needs to verify this. Hunter did, Marisa did, Ross did. One by one, every expert on that call reran the math, and one by one, they fell silent. This is not gravitational, Marisa whispered. There's no perturbation source, no interaction, no cause. It's just moving. That's the moment something inside me went still, like the eye of a storm settling right behind my ribs. I felt strangely detached, listening to the rising panic in the audio channel while my mind stepped outside itself, watching from above. Something was waking up in that object, or being revealed, or shedding its disguise. At 12:52 p.m., the red-violet emissions intensified. The beams sharpened into needles of coherent fluorescence that pulsed in rhythmic intervals, 8 seconds apart. 8. 8. 8. I counted them without meaning to, my brain trying to turn terror into pattern. At 1:03 a.m., the global magnetometer grid spiked, minor at first but then building into a wave that rolled across Earth's atmosphere like a silent, invisible tide. Birds outside my observatory window scattered violently into the dark. The power flickered. My phone vibrated with simultaneous alerts from systems that have never once notified me in 20 years. And through all of it, Atlas continued growing. Redder, brighter, angrier. At 1:27 a.m., something happened that I still don't know how to process. One of the beams hit something near Earth's orbital perimeter. It wasn't a weapon. It wasn't an attack. It was more like a scan, a sweeping line of light that flicked across the void with surgical precision. Space isn't supposed to glow when illuminated, but this line made dust fluoresce. Particles lit up like tracer rounds across the black. And then, for a moment, I swear I saw the beam hesitate, as if it recognized something or locked onto something. Earth. It locked on Earth.
By 2 a.m., NASA's private group confirmed the fear no one wanted to say aloud. Atlas was adjusting acceleration. Not much, barely measurable, but directionally undeniable. It was aiming at us. I remember the pressure in my throat, the taste of copper behind my teeth, my fingers trembling as I saved each frame like they were evidence in a case the universe never prepared us for. I kept waiting for someone to say it was a glitch, a coincidence, a bad read. No one did. And then came the last punch of the night, the part that's still replaying, still clawing at the edges of my sanity. At 2:41 a.m., the central shadow inside Atlas flickered, a pulse of darkness, square edges hidden inside hexagonal ones, layered geometry, nested symmetry, intelligence. Something inside that shape turned. I don't know how I know that. The data doesn't express motion in that sense, but I felt it, a directionality, a gaze, as if whatever was inside Atlas shifted its attention toward the blue-white dot it had just reoriented its path toward us. And then Atlas brightened, a surge, a blooming red flare that washed out half the frame, before collapsing back to its new, monstrous silhouette. That's when the call from Glenn came through. "It's in its final phase," he said. His voice was barely audible, like the words were scraping their way out of him. Whatever Atlas is, it's entering some kind of terminal state. I asked him what terminal meant. He didn't answer. Instead, he sent the last update, the one I'm staring at now, frozen on my screen like an execution order. Trajectory updated. Impact probability 62%. That was 2 hours ago. It's higher now. And we still don't know what Atlas has become, or why it's coming, or what happens when it gets here. But I know one thing with bone-deep certainty. This isn't a comet anymore, and whatever phase it just entered is not a cometary one. At 3:03 a.m., just as I pushed back from the console to clear my head, every monitor in the observatory flashed white for a fraction of a second. Not a system fault, not static, a perfectly coherent white frame, like a camera shutter snapping shut across the entire electromagnetic feed. And for that fraction of a second, Atlas disappeared. Then the image returned, clearer, sharper, like the object allowed itself to be seen in higher resolution. I didn't breathe for a full 4 seconds, because the hexagonal shadow inside it wasn't a shadow anymore. It was opening, like an eye dilating. And the moment that shape widened, the red-violet corona around Atlas flared out in a ring so clean and symmetric it might as well have been drawn with an engineering compass. The beam vectors snapped into tighter alignment, every one of them pointing with surgical precision toward Earth's orbital path. That's where we begin. Because Part 2 isn't about discovery, it's about escalation. Real-time escalation where the thing we've been watching stops pretending it's an object and starts behaving like a system. At 3:10 a.m., the emergency coordination call resumed, but the tone had changed. No frantic voices, no overlapping chatter. Just a brittle, stunned quiet, the kind people carry when they're out of explanations and starting to move on instinct. "The internal geometry is rotating," Marisa said. Her voice was flat, stripped of the warmth she usually carries, like she was reading a eulogy for a future that hasn't died yet. "It's rotating independently of the coma." That shouldn't be possible. Comet nuclei don't have free-floating internal structures. Nothing does. Not naturally. But the images didn't lie. The dark hexagon, and now the deeper nested shape inside it, was spinning at a different angular velocity than the outer shell, like a gyroscope encased in melting ice. "What's the rotation period?" I asked, even though I already knew I wouldn't like the answer. 8 seconds, she said. My mouth went dry. 8 seconds, the same interval as the beam pulses. Synchronization in natural bodies happens, sure. Resonances, feedback patterns, rotational harmonics. But synchronization across color emissions, magnetic interference, vector alignment, and internal structural rotation? That's not nature. That's a system clock. At 3:18 a.m., the next blow hit. The size growth accelerated. Atlas wasn't inflating gradually anymore. It was expanding in pulses, like breathing. With each 8-second rotation, its coma distended outward slightly, then contracted, then flared out again in an even wider plume of red. I could feel my heartbeat syncing with it without meaning to, like some primal part of my brain was latching on to the rhythm. Pulse, pulse, pulse. A planetary heartbeat in the black. And then Hunter said something that made everyone freeze. "It's not expanding," he whispered. "It's unfurling." I didn't understand at first, but then the enhanced frames loaded, and the edges of Atlas's silhouette weren't smooth anymore. They were peeling back, section by section, like enormous pedal plates lifting away from the core. Not breaking, not fragmenting, articulating. As if the outer layer had joints, hinges. I could feel heat crawling up my neck, my stomach hollowing out, because those plates weren't random. They were arranged symmetrically around the core. 6 of them. Hexagonal outside, mobile segments, mechanical symmetry inside organic shroud. I kept hearing my own voice in my head, repeating the same words without sound. This isn't a comet. This isn't a comet. This isn't a comet. But the part that truly turned my bones to ice wasn't the movement. It was what the articulation revealed. Underneath the plates, buried beneath the dust and ice and ancient cosmic frost, was a surface. Smooth, metallic-looking, reflective in a way nothing natural at those temperatures should be. And as the plates peeled back farther, that metallic surface began emitting a faint, steady red illumination, calmer than the violent pulses earlier. Controlled, deliberate, like a pilot light before ignition. "It's entering final phase," Glenn said again. This time, the words didn't feel abstract. They felt like a countdown. At 4:31 a.m., another anomaly hit. This one unlike anything we've ever seen. The internal structure emitted a frequency spike. Not radio, not optical, something deeper. Microwave, maybe. Something between resonance states. I didn't know where it was on the spectrum because the instruments glitched when it hit, overloaded by whatever waveform Atlas pushed through space. But I felt it. In my teeth. A pressure. A hum beneath the skull, vibrating bone more than air. Everyone on the call reacted the same way, hands to jaws, shoulders tightening, heads tilting like animals sensing an earthquake before it arrives. "Turn down your volume," someone said. "It's not audio," I said back. "It's physical." And then seconds later, Earth's ionosphere lit up. A faint red shimmer rippled across the polar data. Barely there, but present. Atlas had touched our atmosphere without being anywhere near it. That's when the panic really began. Not in shouting or screaming, but in the opposite. In the silence that crowded the channel. The kind you can hear someone swallow on the other end of the line. The kind where everyone realizes the stakes have changed and saying it out loud would make it real. At 4:02 a.m., the orbital recalculation came in.
The impact probability had risen to 71%. The projected trajectory narrowed. Atlas wasn't just angling toward Earth, it was adjusting toward a specific vector, a point on the planet. Coordinates. I punched them into a map. My fingers shook as I watched the red pin drop onto North America. More specifically, Colorado, near a region filled with deep underground infrastructure, research labs, defense sites, monitoring stations, the kind of places governments insist don't exist. I stared at the screen, pulse thundering, wondering whether the thing in the sky was coming for something buried under our own soil. Before I could overthink it, another file arrived. This one from an Air Force tracking array, unauthorized, marked internal only. The subject line hit me like a fist. Object detected emitting structured data stream. It was transmitting. Not noise, not radiation, data. Encoded, directional, toward Earth. We didn't know what the pattern meant. Binary, phase-modulated, packeted in bursts tied to that same 8-second rotation, but it was unmistakably structured. Atlas wasn't just evolving, it was communicating. And it wasn't communicating with us. It was sending something at us. A message? A lock? A signal? At 4:19 a.m., the internal rotation slowed. For the first time since the pulses began, the clock stuttered. 8 seconds stretched to 8.4, then 8.9, like something inside was straining, winding up, charging, and the red beams intensified, thin threads sharpening into spears of coherent light. Not lasers exactly, something else, something hotter, more controlled. I could feel every hair on my arms lift as if the air pressure in the observatory had dropped. "What's it doing?" Hunter whispered. No one answered, but I knew. I felt it in the hollow between my ribs, in the tight coil of dread wrapping around my spine. Atlas was aligning. At 4:43 a.m., Glenn finally broke the silence. We need to prepare for the possibility this is not a passive object. No one argued, but then the twist, the one that still makes my hands shake as I recount it, hit at 4:41 a.m., right when the internal rotation completed another rotation. A new dataset appeared in the feed, telemetry from a small civilian telescope in Nevada, one not tied into our official network. A teenager running a backyard rig had posted a sequence of photos online. We grabbed them the moment they appeared because the timestamps matched our observation window. And when the enhanced processing finished, the blood drained from my face. Something massive was visible behind Atlas, a shape we hadn't detected because it emitted no light. A void, a hollow in the star field, a silhouette in motion. Atlas wasn't alone, and when the automated star subtraction filter revealed the outline, every molecule of air in my lungs froze, because the shape wasn't random. It was geometric too, larger, darker, positioned perfectly along the same line of trajectory, as if Atlas wasn't traveling alone, as if Atlas was leading something, or being led by something, or being carried. My vision blurred for a moment. I don't know if it was fear, or disbelief, or the sudden weight of knowing we missed something enormous because we were too focused on the bright thing to see the dark thing trailing behind it. "Is that a shadow?" someone asked. "No," I said. "Shadows don't move independently of light sources." "Then what is it?" I swallowed hard. My voice felt like it belonged to someone else when I finally spoke. "Another phase." because there's no other explanation. Atlas wasn't just evolving. It wasn't just aiming. It wasn't just signaling. It was revealing, unfolding, acting as a herald for something much larger. And whatever that dark shape is, whatever massive, silent thing is slipping through the void behind Atlas, it just adjusted its orientation too, toward Earth. So if you're still with me, if your pulse is racing like mine, if your brain is trying to stitch logic onto a thing that refuses to be logical, understand this one truth. We're not watching an object anymore. We're watching an arrival. And everything we believed about 3I Atlas being the threat, we were wrong. Atlas isn't the threat. Atlas is the key. And whatever it's unlocking is almost here.
I thought the rotating core was the limit. I thought the articulated plates were the ceiling. I thought the dark silhouette behind Atlas, God, I thought that was the endgame. But part 3 starts with something worse. Because at 5:02 a.m., right as the last calculations from Nevada were sinking into our system, the dark object behind Atlas vanished. Not moved, not drifted, vanished. A whole gravitationally significant mass, something the size of a small moon, blinked out of the star field like someone cut a frame out of the universe with scissors. I stared at the empty patch of sky until my vision blurred, willing it to reappear, to resolve as a glitch, a reflection, anything. But it didn't. Instead, Atlas brightened, no, ignited. The red and violet corona surged outward in a perfectly circular bloom, like a shockwave of light without the shock. The internal hexagon widened like an aperture, articulated plates sliding back with the precision of engineered petals, not natural fractures. And the metallic core underneath, for the first time, reflected starlight cleanly, not scattered, reflected, like a polished surface waiting for activation. I heard my own breath catch, shallow and involuntary, as if my lungs recognized the shape before my brain did. At 5:07 a.m., the beam emissions shifted frequency, not intensity, frequency. They stopped pulsing at 8-second intervals and began a steady, continuous glow, the kind you'd expect from a machine leaving standby mode and entering full operational state. And the moment that shift stabilized, my console lit up with alerts, not just optical, gravitational. Something in the field around Atlas distorted space. A gentle ripple at first, like the faint warping seen around massive bodies, then stronger, sharper, a wave pattern, concentric, and expanding outward across the star field. I felt it in my bones the way you feel thunder before you hear it, an atmospheric pressure drop in the soul, not in the room. "It's making a gravity well," Marissa said, her voice tight but controlled. "A localized well. But it's not stable." She was right. It looked less like a gravitational well and more like a trembling tear, oscillating, shimmering, warping the background starlight in rhythmic patterns. I think that's when we realized what Atlas was doing. It wasn't evolving, it wasn't signaling, it was opening something. A doorway, a channel, a gate. I don't know what word fits because none fits. And before you think I'm being dramatic, understand this. The wave pattern from Atlas synchronized perfectly with the moment the dark mass behind it disappeared. One vanished as the other initiated the well, as if one stepped through and the other held the door open. At 5:13 a.m., a NASA Deep Space Radar ping returned data that broke the room. It wasn't even the content of the data. It was the metadata, the timestamp jitter, a 9-millisecond temporal discrepancy. Space doesn't do that. Time doesn't slip like that, unless something is bending it. I think I whispered "no" under my breath, but I'm not sure. Maybe it was someone else. Maybe it was all of us.
Then at 5:16, the first transmission hit our sensors, not from Atlas, not from Earth, but between them. A mid-space, mid-spectrum resonance, something that shouldn't even be possible in a vacuum. A carrier wave with no source point, just a growing amplitude. A compression, the kind you feel coming up a tunnel before the train. Hunter tried to isolate the origin. He triangulated, retriangulated, rechecked. He swore at the console, something he never does, then said it aloud. It's coming from the corridor. That was the first time anyone in the room used the word corridor. Not gate, not anomaly, corridor. And it felt too right, too literal. A passage through which something might travel. My pulse hammered so loudly I could hear it in my own ears, because if there was a corridor, then the dark object that vanished had gone into it, and that meant something could come out. At 5:20, the resonance strengthened. The wave flattened into a stable band. Atlas's beams contracted into razor-thin lines and locked onto Earth's upper atmosphere, directly onto the Colorado coordinates again. It wasn't drifting. It wasn't sampling. It was aiming. Locking. Aligning. And then the surface beneath those beams began to separate. Not into petals this time, into layers. Nested sheets peeling back with mechanical precision. A machine awakening piece by piece, shedding its camouflage. I had to bite the inside of my cheek to stay grounded, because the moment that shell retracted, the exposed feature underneath wasn't a core. It wasn't an engine. It wasn't a heart. It was a lens. A perfectly circular concave lens spanning the entire central structure of the object, a cosmic scale aperture. And behind that lens, something was moving. Slow. Rhythmic. Like a pulse, or footsteps. Each throb of red and violet light surged behind the inner chamber walls as if something was crossing from the corridor into Atlas, using it as a bridge. This isn't an object, I said. It's a receiver. No one disagreed. At 5:25, the first visible distortion appeared inside the lens, a shimmer, a ripple, like heat above asphalt, but in the void of space. The background stars twisted, elongated, compressed. I could feel bile rising in my throat. Something behind that shimmer was pushing through. The corridor was no longer hypothetical, it was functional. And Atlas was the anchor point. The entryway. At 5:29 a.m., the atmosphere above Earth responded again, but stronger this time. A red auroral bloom spread across the magnetic field lines faster than anything natural, spiraling outward from the polar caps like some enormous fingerprint being pressed against the planet. The synchronization wasn't subtle. The pulses from Atlas matched the rhythm of the atmospheric disturbances perfectly. Earth was being scanned, or prepared, or locked. My hands shook so badly I had to brace them against the desk, because the twist, the mid-story inversion, hit right then in one line of raw, unfiltered data from the monitoring array. The gravitational signature Atlas is generating matches Earth's. I stared at the line so long I forgot to breathe. Atlas wasn't just aiming at Earth, it was mirroring Earth, copying its gravitational profile, mapping it, preparing for something big enough or sensitive enough to require gravitational compatibility to pass through. It wasn't signaling to Earth, it was synchronizing with Earth, locking into us like a docking procedure. "Something is coming through," Marissa whispered, "and it needs the planet to match frequency." And then, God help us, something moved inside the lens. Not a shadow, not a distortion, a shape. Slow, smooth, too deliberate to be noise, too fluid to be mechanical, too coherent to be natural. A silhouette with no analog in anything we've ever seen. It stretched, contracted, shifted like it was tasting the geometry of our universe before committing to entry. My chest tightened until it hurt, because I realized something in that moment, something none of us said aloud but all of us felt. Atlas wasn't approaching Earth for impact. It was docking with Earth, forming a bridge, creating a compatible doorway between two gravitational signatures for a transit event. And the dark object behind Atlas, the one that vanished, had likely already passed through. That's when the hope hit. A tiny flicker, fragile, irrational. Maybe the object wasn't hostile. Maybe it was seeking connection, exploration, not invasion, not destruction.
A clean, surgical white, like the beginning of a sterilization burn. A beam accumulated inside the aperture. Quiet, focused, terrifyingly stable. And the Colorado coordinates updated again, down to the meter, down to a facility that isn't on any public map but absolutely exists. The corridor stabilized at 5:38 a.m. A piercing harmonic tone spread through the observatory. Mechanical, electromagnetic, gravitational, all at once. The kind of sound you don't hear with your ears, but with your organs. I doubled over. Someone else dropped a headset. Someone else cursed. I tasted copper. And then the last message of the hour arrived, not from Atlas, not from the corridor, but from NORAD. A simple, chilling, classified directive. Prepare for breach event. Estimated contact in 54 minutes. I stared at it until the letters blurred, because in that moment the truth solidified. Atlas wasn't the threat. The thing behind Atlas wasn't the threat. The breach was the threat. The corridor was the threat. The synchronization was the threat. And whatever was pressing against that lens was already halfway here.
I didn't move for almost a full minute after NORAD's message came through. 54 minutes. That was the estimate. Not for impact, not for arrival in orbit, for breach. A word no one had ever used in any astronomical context because breaches don't happen in space. Not unless something is forcing its way across a boundary that shouldn't exist. And that's exactly what Atlas had become. A boundary turned inside out. Part II begins at the moment my fear stopped being a vague cosmic dread and hardened into something sharp and personal. Because at 5:39 a.m., 1 minute after NORAD's alert, every magnetometer station across the northern hemisphere registered a spike so violent it overrode their automated limiters. The Earth's magnetic field didn't just ripple, it lurched, like something massive brushed against it from the outside. The entire planet flexed, a planetary flinch, and Atlas brightened in response. A direct correlation, undeniable and instantaneous. The corridor had become two-way. I had one hand braced on the console and the other on my chest because my heart felt like it was trying to punch its way out of my ribs. The lens inside Atlas was now wide open, a circular wound cut into the universe, edges shimmering like liquid glass under pressure. Behind it, the silhouette was larger, more defined. Not a creature, not a ship, at least not in any recognizable sense, but a structure, a geometry that rotated on axes we don't have mathematics for. Every rotation changed its shape without changing its mass.
a thing that folded itself through dimensions like origami made of space. We were seeing maybe 1/500th of its total form, projected through the aperture. And that 1/500th was enough for me to feel like I was witnessing something humans were never meant to comprehend with naked senses. At 5:42 a.m., the red aurora over the poles intensified until the upper atmosphere looked bruised. Satellite telemetry went haywire, sun-synchronous orbits drifting, GPS constellations wobbling off course, not because of solar interference, because of gravitational distortion. Earth's mass signature was being tuned. That's the only way I can describe it. Atlas was forcing our planet into resonance with the corridor, so whatever was coming through could anchor itself. "We need to shut this down," someone said over the comms. I don't remember who. The voice was strained, cracking. "What? Shut down what? What exactly do you propose we shut down?" It was true. There was no mechanism, no tool, no switch. We could no more stop Atlas than we could stop the tide by slapping the ocean. And then, through all that chaos, through all the panic and scrambling and attempts to model an event no one on Earth had ever conceived of, one line of data appeared on my screen that made me feel like the universe had just whispered something directly into my ear. In the corridor resonance, encoded in the amplitude spikes, hidden between the pulses, there was a pattern, a recognition handshake, a mathematical signature, a match to Earth's gravitational fingerprint. This thing wasn't scanning Earth. It already knew us, as if it had our signature on file. My vision went blurry at the edges, the way it does before fainting, because that meant only one thing. This wasn't a random arrival. Someone, or something, had done this before, or had prepared for us specifically. I didn't have time to spiral into that thought because at 5:47 a.m., Atlas shifted orientation again. The entire structure rotated, aligning the aperture with absolute precision toward Colorado. The coordinates updated, this time pinpointing a specific underground facility. A place I only knew from whispers in defense circles. Deep Zone Array 4, a gravitational monitoring base built for black-budget research into exotic mass anomalies. The exact kind of place that would detect something like this before anyone else. The exact kind of place something might want access to. The exact kind of place a corridor might need an anchor. My tongue felt thick. My palms were numb. Because if whatever was coming through needed a gravitational node, then the arrival wasn't a scattershot insertion into Earth. It was a targeted insertion into a facility built explicitly to monitor gravitational anomalies. Atlas wasn't just docking with Earth. It was docking with Deep Zone. At 5:51, the corridor pulsed, hard. The white light behind the lens intensified until it washed out half the starfield. The silhouette twisted, unfolded, expanded. The aperture quivered. I thought it would rupture. The entire observatory trembled like a jet passing overhead, but there was no sound, no air displacement, just raw pressure in the bones, a subdermal hum that made me clamp my teeth until my jaw ached. "We're past precursor stage," Glenn said. "This is main transit." Every cell in my body rebelled at those words. The idea that an object larger than a city, larger than a country, was sliding through a hole in the laws of physics pointed directly at us was too big to hold in the mind. But then came the moment that cracked something inside me. At 5:54 a.m., the corridor brightened, not outward, but inward, like something on the other side struck the boundary. The lens bulged, a ring of red-violet devoured the edges. A ripple ran down the aperture like a shiver. And then something touched through. Not fully. A tendril of geometry, a shape that bent wrong, a limb or appendage or probe made of angles instead of matter. It slid toward the aperture's edge, hesitated as if evaluating the local parameters, then pressed against the boundary so hard the lens warped like hot plastic. I stumbled backward from the monitor, my chair toppled behind me, because instinct, ancient, buried, animal, roared through my nervous system. You are prey. Do not be seen. Do not move. Atlas flared, stabilizing the boundary around the intruding geometry. The gravitational well deepened. Earth's field buckled. And then the silhouette withdrew slightly, as if waiting, as if the corridor wasn't fully open, as if something on our end wasn't ready yet. At 5:59, the clock on my console blinked with a new alert. Something was happening underground. The Deep Zone facility, silent since the first Atlas anomaly, broadcast a short encrypted burst. I decrypted it automatically, without thinking, hands shaking. One line of text appeared. Breach event expected. Holding. Holding what? The answer came 10 seconds later, when a second line of data from Deep Zone's mass sensors synced into our system. The gravitational signature beneath the facility was shifting. Not Earth's field. Something underground. Something moving. Something waking up. I stared hard at the numbers because they didn't make sense. The mass fluctuation wasn't local. It wasn't geological. It was harmonic. Like something inside the facility was synchronizing with the corridor. Like something down there was answering back. What the hell are they doing? They're not doing anything, I said. Something in that facility is reacting to Atlas. But what? There's nothing in Deep Zone except... He stopped, because we both remembered.
Because at 6:08 a.m., the corridor didn't widen. It didn't pulse. It didn't flare. It went still. Perfectly, impossibly still. And stillness from something that large, that active, that alive with energy. Stillness is worse than motion, because stillness means intent. Atlas dimmed to a dull red glow, as if conserving power. The articulated plates folded tighter. The beams narrowed to hairline threads aimed with sniper-like precision at the Colorado coordinates. For the first time since this began, it wasn't expanding. It wasn't unfurling. It was waiting. Why did it stop? Someone breathed through the comm. No one answered. We all knew the answer anyway. The relic under Deep Zone had reached synchronization, and whatever was coming through the corridor was holding for final lock. At 6:10 a.m., my console lit with a new waveform, not from Atlas, not from the corridor, from underground. A harmonic signature rose from beneath the Rocky Mountains, a deep, pulsing vibration, like a massive bell being struck underwater. My teeth rattled, my skull vibrated. The relic was calling back. The corridor responded instantly, shimmering with a higher resonance, the aperture trembling like a veil caught in a rising tide. The silhouette behind it expanded, then compressed and reoriented in a way that made my stomach drop. It was aligning with the relic now, not Atlas. Atlas had become irrelevant, just the doorman, its job nearly finished. The real event was between the thing approaching and the thing waiting below our feet. And that's when the twist hit, the one that reframed everything I thought I knew. The gravitational signature from the relic wasn't just harmonic, it was identical, matching the corridor's intruding geometry with precision down to the 11th decimal place. They weren't counterparts, they weren't components. They were the same object, separated by a boundary we didn't know existed until Atlas tore it open. One half buried on Earth decades ago, the other half approaching now. A reunion, a completion, a return. And Earth was about to be the meeting point. At 6:16 a.m., the relic's containment chamber reached critical threshold. Deep Zone sent one final encrypted burst before going silent. Containment failure, imminent. Stand by. Then nothing. Communications dead. Power gone. As if something down there was sucking every joule into itself.
I remember bracing my hands on the console, telling myself to focus, to breathe, to analyze. But another part of me, the part wired for survival, kept screaming to run, to get out of the observatory, to hide, as if distance mattered. At 6:19 a.m., Atlas brightened again, slowly this time, like embers inhaling oxygen. The lens flared white, the aperture dilated to its maximum recorded diameter, and through it, the silhouette began to emerge. Not teleportation, not projection, actual emergence. A structure unfolding through the barrier like a hand pushing through thin ice. Geometry dripping into our universe in shapes that inverted and reinverted in ways my eyes struggled to track. The corridor flexed, warping the stars around it in spirals of distorted light. And then the object pressed fully against the threshold, massive, breathing, waiting for the matching signature beneath Earth to finalize the lock. "How big is it?" someone whispered. No answer. We didn't have the math. We only had scale. Atlas was the size of a mountain. The object behind it dwarfed Atlas. A city-sized silhouette pushing into our space. A mothership. A structure. A piece of something unimaginably old and incomprehensibly advanced. And as it pressed forward, a sound rolled through the observatory, deep, resonant, multi-layered. A pulsation of tones that made my chest vibrate until my ribs ached. It wasn't sound. It wasn't radio. It wasn't electromagnetic. It was gravitational. A message encoded in mass and frequency. A message directed at the relic. A command. At 6:23, the relic answered. A shockwave burst from underneath Colorado, not outward through the ground, but upward through the air, visible only in how birds dropped from the sky, how clouds shivered apart, how the red aurora over the poles tightened into a spiraling whirlpool above North America. Then the ground itself shifted. A tremor. A deep, resonant thud, as if something enormous turned beneath the crust. "It's rising," I whispered without meaning to. Because the mass signature wasn't stationary anymore. It was moving. The relic, whatever it truly was coming to the surface. I watched the numbers climb, depth decreasing, resonance increasing, heat signatures spiking. It was waking in full, taking in power Earth never meant to hold. Atlas flared once more, sending a final surge of red energy into the corridor, stabilizing the passage. The silhouette behind the lens tensed as if preparing to step through. And then, the twist. The final one. The one that snapped the last thread of hope I didn't realize I was holding. At 6:27 a.m., the relic beneath Colorado emitted a burst of energy unlike anything we've ever measured. Not a greeting, not a response, not a welcome. A rejection, a denial. A counter-harmonic. It didn't want reunion. It didn't want retrieval. It didn't want to be part of whatever was coming. It was resisting, fighting, screaming. And the corridor shuddered violently as the frequencies collided. The silhouette inside buckled as if slammed by an invisible force. The aperture shrank suddenly, then expanded, then flickered like a failing heartbeat. Atlas dimmed sharply, struggling to hold the door open. The entire system, Earth, Atlas, the corridor, the intruding mass, the relic, was slipping out of sync. A catastrophic failure of the lock. That's when the stakes skyrocketed past anything any of us had imagined. Because the corridor wasn't designed to fail. If the lock collapsed mid-transit, the energy release would be beyond anything Earth's atmosphere, crust, or magnetic field could handle. A tear in space-time collapsing on a planet. A gravitational snapback. A multi-dimensional recoil. Extinction level. Guaranteed. "The relic! It's destabilizing the connection," Glenn shouted. "It's trying to shut the corridor." "Why?" Hunter shouted back. "Why would it fight the thing it belongs to?" I already knew. I didn't know how I knew, but the truth sat in my chest like ice. Because the relic wasn't part of the intruding object. It wasn't a missing piece. It wasn't a component waiting to be rejoined. It was something stolen, taken, hidden, a prisoner. And the thing coming through the corridor wasn't its partner. It was its captor. At 6:31, the relic emitted a second rejection pulse, stronger than the first. The intrusion silhouette spasmed, writhing in geometry that bent the starfield like wet fabric. Atlas flared violently, trying to hold the lock steady. The beams over Earth stuttered. The red aurora fractured into spiraling shards across the magnetic poles. The planet groaned under the strain. "If that corridor collapses," someone started. But we all knew. It wouldn't be a collapse. It would be a detonation, a rupture of physics at planetary scale. Earth would crack like a ceramic plate smashed on concrete. And yet the relic pulsed again, harder. A refusal, a scream, a demand to be left where it was. To stay buried, to stay hidden, to keep the corridor from completing. The intruding silhouette thrashed with impossible angles. The aperture shook. Atlas's outer shell ruptured, plates cracking like stressed steel. And then, for one moment, everything froze. The silhouette stopped fighting. The relic stopped pulsing. The corridor held. A perfect, fragile balance. And then the final blow. At 6:34 a.m., the intruding object made a decision. A final attempt to force the reunion. It surged into the corridor, triggering a gravitational shockwave so violent the observatory windows bowed inward. I felt a pressure in my head so sharp I nearly blacked out. The relic screamed back. The corridor split, light inverted, and in one blinding moment of white, the connection severed. Not closed, not shut. Severed. The silhouette vanished.